Please repeat with me. We, the members and friends of the First Congregational Church of Stockbridge, pledge to remain faithful to the charge presented to us today, to the families now before us. We pledge our collective love and wisdom, as well as our individual care and nurturing. We pledge to provide these children an environment in which they may discern for themselves the meaning and purpose of life through Christ, who was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, offering them the fullness and happiness to life to which we all strive.
One of the things that's special about our particular tradition in Christianity is we believe that God can speak to you directly, not only through your own experiences, but through the Bible. And so we give you this Bible with a prayer that God will speak to you through the Bible, and that as God speaks to you, you will be able to share your insight with the rest of the community. And so we present these Bibles to you now. Let's have a prayer before you go and return to your seats. God, we ask that you bless these hearts, these minds, these eyes and ears, and these words, that your will might be revealed through your Scripture and through the hearts of those who study it. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you. You can return to your seats now.
In earlier times, the Mohican tribe had only visited the Great Meadow in Stockbridge during hunting season. Before the early 1600s, they had lived undisturbed with other tribes in North America for centuries. To these natives, America was not a new world, nor New England, but their ancestral home. The Mohican, who had enjoyed a self-sustaining and unspoiled paradise, were about to experience an environmental holocaust and genocide brought in first by the Dutch, then by the English. By 1680, surrounded by Europeans, the tribe was driven from the west bank of the Hudson River and forced to hide in the forest near the Great Meadow in Stockbridge. Pushed from the west by the Dutch, among the last of the Mohicans ran into the English Puritan settlers or intruders in Stockbridge. In 1854, Stockbridge, Massachusetts town historian Miss Electa Fidelia Jones wrote in her Stockbridge Past and Present, or Records of an Old Mission Station, of the Mohican tribe who had 100 years earlier left the town in great numbers. By the English they were called River Indians, but those who lived in Berkshire County came afterwards to be called Housatonic Indians. They used bow and arrows to kill game, with which they were very expert. They also used to catch deer by ensnaring them with strings. By hunting, they supplied themselves with clothing and diet. They seldom feel much want, and they were very much contented in their condition. Having food and raiment was their only aim. They were not to kill more than necessary, for there was none to barter with them that would have tempted them to waste their animals, as they did after the Chakotay, or white people, came on this island. Consequently, the game was never depleted. They hunted occasionally a whole year, but hunting seasons are properly divided into two parts of a year. In fall they hunt for deer, bear, beaver, otter, raccoon, fisher, marten for their clothing, and drying meat for the ensuing season. And in the beginning of March they used to go out to hunt for moose on the Green Mountains, where these animals keep for winter quarters. From thence they go again for beaver, hunting soon as the rivers, ponds, and creeks are opened, but they used to take good care not to stay out over 2 months. But the wandering habits and the untutored mind of the Indian would, after all, tend to obliterate from their memories everything beyond the leading facts, and a historian was set apart, whose office it was to both record events and to store up in his own mind the facts recorded by his predecessors, training in turn others to succeed him. Then some, and perhaps all tribes, gathered themselves together at certain seasons, and the historian, taking a piece of wampum from the bag, repeated aloud its meaning, and passed it to the person who sat next to him, who followed his example. And thus each piece was recited at least annually by every member of the tribe, male and female. According to a history of the Stockbridge Nation, written in 1883 by historian John Nelson Davidson, a great people came from the northwest, crossed over the salt waters, and after long and weary pilgrimage, planting many colonies on their track, took possession and built fires upon the Atlantic coast, extending from the Delaware to the south, to the Penobscot to the north. They became in the process of time divided into different tribes and interests, all, however, speaking one common dialect. In 1722, a Hudson River Mohican chief wrote to the governor of New York, "When our people come from hunting to the town or plantations and acquaint the traders and people that we want powder and shot and clothing, they first give us a large cup of rum, and after we get the taste of it, crave for more, so that all the beaver and peltry we have hunted goes for drink, and we are left destitute either of clothing or ammunition. Therefore we desire our father to order the tap to be shut and to prohibit selling of rum, for as long as the Christians will sell rum, our people will drink it." The Mohican press wrote, "While some English genuinely extended a brotherly hand, others viewed the Indians with hateful suspicion. Adding to the confusion were the Dutch traders, who responded to the English requests that they not sell rum to the Mohicans by aggressively stepping up their sales. The Dutch claimed the English were slowly enslaving the Mohicans. The English countered that the Dutch had already done so through alcohol." Also in Stockbridge lived Chief Concopat. In 1724, before the arrival of the Puritans, the Dutch had already arrived and were in business. According to historian John Nelson Davidson, the General Court legislature of the colony granted to some whites 2 townships of land in that vicinity. This gift was subject to the rights of the Indians. A chief named Concopat and 20 others of the tribe signed the deed 1724, April 25th. The consideration was 460 pounds sterling legal tender, 3 barrels of cider, and 30 quarts of rum. The Indians kept 2 small reservations, Scotticook now in Sheffield, and Wadacook, Stockbridge, 10 miles north. Already decimated by smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other diseases brought from Europe, the entire tribe of Mohicans consisted of about 100 people. European diseases wiped out perhaps 90% or more of native North Americans. In 1609, Henry Hudson sailed the Half Moon from Amsterdam to New York Harbor and up the Hudson River to Albany. Along the way, he traded with native tribes and received shells, beads, and furs. Henry Hudson introduced the river tribes to alcohol and firearms and established the Dutch fur trade. Each year, Dutch ships plied the Hudson to trade for beaver pelts. A large European market for leather meant that now armed with rifles instead of bows and arrows, the tribe enthusiastically reduced the animal population. But the Mohicans depended on deer for food and clothing and to barter amongst themselves. Without things to barter, the tribe would incur debts to white people. After the European arrival, the Mohican used the animals as a business rather than food and shelter. Introducing that concept to North America, the Dutch gave the Mohican jobs. Unfortunately, the job was to kill off all the American wildlife and sell the pelts to the Dutch for export. In 1527, King Henry VIII asked Roman Catholic Pope Clement to annul his marriage to the Queen so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. Instead, the Pope excommunicated him for having a child with the Queen's lady-in-waiting. In 1531, Henry convinced English Parliament to declare him to be God's agent on earth. Fighting Protestantism, King Henry burned Lutherans at the stake. In 1534, King Henry severed all religious connections with Rome, founded the Church of England, and declared himself to be the supreme head of the Church, which allowed him to annul his own marriage to the Queen and marry Anne Boleyn. Henry's next act, from 1536 to 1541, was the dissolution of the monasteries. He seized all the church property and buildings in England and sold off the Roman Catholic Church assets, estimated to be 1/5 of the country's entire wealth. Then the king owned 25% of England's prime farmland. Many of the monks, driven from their sanctuaries, had no choice but to put their distilling skills to use. Their knowledge of distilling quickly spread to others and formed what would eventually become the Scotch whisky industry. Known for a series of small unsuccessful wars, Henry VIII invented the battleship. With the new technology of cast-iron cannons, Henry changed the course of naval warfare by lining up 3 gun decks on each side of the Mary Rose. Henry Tudor, once a healthy and athletic man, eventually went insane and, weighing 392 pounds, died a miserable death. 30 years later, around 1560, under Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry and Anne, the Protestant Reformation started by Martin Luther had taken hold. Elizabeth outlawed Roman Catholicism, then advocating stricter religious discipline and simplification of the ceremonies and creeds held over from Roman Catholic days. The Puritans, who regarded themselves as more godly than the Church of England, formed their own group within the Church. Born in 1607, John Harvard was a Church of England member and a Puritan congregational minister. In 1636, the Great and General Court of the English colony of Massachusetts Bay allocated funds for the establishment of a college to educate ministers for the Congregational Church. With his wife, John Harvard arrived in America in 1637. Settling near Boston, he was minister of the Charlestown Congregational Church for only 1 year before dying at age 31 of tuberculosis. He left his books and a sum of money to the school that was given the name Harvard College. An early brochure published by Harvard College stated the purpose: to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches. Harvard College offered a classic academic course based on the English university model, but consistent with the prevailing Puritan philosophy of the first colonists. Puritan ministers founded many of the first colleges and universities in America. Harvard, Yale, Dartmouth, Williams, Bowdoin, Middlebury, and Amherst were founded by ministers to educate and train other Puritan ministers. In each town, it was usually called the First Congregational Church. The white steeples throughout New England mark the churches that these Puritan ministers founded. In 1701, a group of 10 Harvard alumni met in Branford, Connecticut, in the study of Reverend Samuel Russell, and pooled their books to form the library of Yale College. These men were all congregational ministers who objected to the liberalism of Harvard. This easing of the requirements of the Puritan religion would be a recurring theme. The founders of Yale declared their objective: that youth may be instructed in the arts and sciences, who through the blessing of God may be fitted for public employment, both in church and civil state. Students were required to live religious, godly, and blameless lives according to the rules of God's Word, diligently reading the Holy Scriptures, the fountain of light and truth, and constantly attend upon all the duties of religion, both in public and secret. Prayer was a requirement. Every Yale student was instructed to consider the main end of his study, to wit, to know God in Jesus Christ, and to lead a godly, sober life. This insistence on abstinence from alcohol put the Puritans on a collision course with the Dutch. The English, who had fled a population explosion in Europe, and the last remnants of the Mohican tribe, met in Stockbridge and agreed to worship together and work together to form in the wilderness first an English church, then a town. The Puritans were transplanting their English system of theocracy, where the political leader is divinely guided. The Mohicans had no choice but to go along with this system and to try to fit in. Extinct except for around 30 families, the Mohicans agreed to share the land with the Puritan Congregationalists and adopt Christianity. English Puritans and Mohican families worshiped together in the First Congregational Church original building. Known as the Meeting House and built of wood, it stood from 1739 to 1785 at the place now marked by the Reverend Field Memorial Chimes Tower, which was built in 1878. After 4 days' deliberation in 1734, The Reverend John Sargent was ordained and accepted as minister to the tribe by Chief Congopot and Chief Umpachini. Sargent thought that it was in the best interest of the Mohicans to become farmers and to learn English. The Reverend John Sargent, first member of the First Congregational Church of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, was born in 1710 in Newark, New Jersey. He was graduated first in his class in 1929 from Yale College, where he learned Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Also from Yale in 1732, John Sargent received a second bachelor's degree in theology. On one of the highest points of land in town, Reverend Sargent built his house. His Stockbridge home, the relocated mission house, still stands as a museum at 19 Main Street, moved from its original location near the Divine Mercy Church on Eden Hill. In Stockbridge lived a Dutch trader, Joachim van Valkenburg, the first white man to arrive in the Great Meadow. Van Valkenburg acted as translator and sold the Mohicans gunpowder, lead, and after free samples, quarts of rum. Viewed as a vice by the Congregationalists, Reverend Sargent called the tribesmen's alcohol addiction their beloved destruction. Van Valkenburg was unhappy with Sargent's interfering with his profitable business in rum. Reverend Sargent preached that the rum traders were evil and that Van Valkenburg was Satan himself. Van Valkenburg told the Mohican tribesmen that when they were told not to drink, their freedom and basic rights were being violated and that they were being used as dogs and slaves by the English. Reverend John Sargent worked to form the first Indian town. In 1739, the town of Stockbridge was formed, and the Mohicans began to be called the Stockbridge Indians. With only 6 English families, it was a congregational town, with Colonel Ephraim Williams of Newton as moderator, Chief Umpachini and Chief Congopot as selectmen, and Josiah Jones as constable in the shared government. Colonel Williams was Stockbridge's first citizen and real estate developer, and the father of the founder of Williams College. Sargent, fluent in at least 5 languages, learned Mohican, which he said was guttural like Hebrew. It took John Sargent 2 days to write his 35-page weekly sermon, which took 2 hours to deliver and was done twice, once in each language. The Reverend Sargent also wrote a complete vocabulary translation and translated most of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament except Revelations into Mohican. He also said that he found preaching to them in their native language to be exhausting. From his pulpit, Reverend Sargent told the Mohicans in their language that evil was punished in hell and that good deeds were rewarded in an afterlife, and that God was merciful. Eschewing the Calvinist doctrines of Jonathan Edwards, Sargent did not believe in a vengeful and angry God. However, the Mohican tribe had no concept of an afterlife. From a culture of abundance, the Mohican displeased the competitive English with a lack of enthusiasm for farming. Staring for hours at natural events like schools of fish in the Housatonic River showed that they were in harmony with nature, but caused the English to view them as lazy. With an entire government and religion, which the tribe did not reveal to the white people at the time, Chief Congopot's tribe had no choice but to follow Jesus and become Christians. John Sargent, who saw the Mohicans as heathen savages, underestimated the tribe. He wrote, "We're a very miserable and degenerate part of the human race, with their own foolish, barbarous, and wicked custom. Knew nothing like government among themselves. Had an aversion to everything that restrains their liberty." Although Sargent taught the Mohicans that it was wrong to roam the woods and live in wigwams, and that they were to build houses and live in them and become farmers like the English, during maple sugar season in the spring, the tribe would leave town and move into the woods. The Mohicans, using their wigwams, could move through the woods, set up camp, and move on, all without a trace. Miss Jones wrote, "When the Indians went to the woods this year at sugar season, Mr. Sargent and Mr. Woodbridge accompanied them, and in that way greatly increased the opportunities of doing good and of gaining their language. Night and morning Mr. Sargent says he led their devotions, and when the labors of the day were over, taught the Indians to sing. His bed consisted of a deerskin spread upon boughs of the spruce, and 3 blankets for his covering. Their diet was low but cleanly and well cooked by the wives of Congopot and Umpicini. Their drink was cold water. Mr. Sargent spent a part of the time at Wanacook and part at Scottahook, changing places with Mr. Woodbridge. According to Patrick Fraser, who wrote The Mohicans of Stockbridge in 1992, when spring maple season arrived in 1736, Sargent and Woodbridge chose to relocate to the temporary camps rather than interrupt the process of religion. The two bookish young men would spend 6 weeks in and out of fragile wigwams, walking on snowshoes over 1.5 feet of snow, sleeping on a blanket covered with deer hide spread over spruce boughs with 3 more blankets on top of them. Our Indians are this week going out to make sugar. Mr. Woodbridge and I designed to go out to them next day after tomorrow and live with them till they return if we can hold it out. Perhaps we will be so taken with them and their way of living that we shall take each of us a wife from amongst and sadly disappoint all other fair ones that may have expectation from us. And indeed, I am almost of the opinion this will be our wisest course, lest if we don't disappoint them, they will us. Reverend Sargent later married Abigail Williams, a girl of 17, the daughter of Ephraim Williams. Later their son, also named John Sargent, worked with the relocated Mohican in Madison and Oneida County, New York. Good Chief Congopot died in 1745. After only 15 years in the ministry, the Reverend John Sargent died at age 39 in 1749 of tuberculosis. At that time there were 12 English families in town. The Mohican Press wrote, "The Stockbridge Mohicans became a people groping in the dark. It was Sargent who had guided them on their path now the shepherd was gone. Further pressure was bearing down on the Stockbridge Indians in a way of land ownership. The colonials wanted the Indians to define property boundaries individually. The Mohicans resisted, sensing a short end of the stick deal and suspicious of the colonials' intentions. Eventually, individual land allotments were recorded, though the Mohicans maintained common lands as well. Furthermore, the Mohicans had to contend with social vices. Just 1 month after Sargent's death, a tavern was opened at Stockbridge and the floodgates were opened. The situation had deteriorated so much that the Wappingers were complaining to the Moravian missionaries that the Stockbridge Indians had become wild drunkards. By 1751, 1 year after John Sargent's death, with no one to look after their interests, Mohicans had left in large numbers. As a youth, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards was fascinated by spiders. In his 1741 sermon in Enfield, Connecticut, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," Reverend Edwards preached, "O sinner, consider the fearful danger you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath. You hang by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about it, and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. And you have no interest in any mediator, and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you have ever done, nothing that you can do to induce God to spare you 1 moment. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over a fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire." This sermon, preaching horror, is the archetype for what was called fire and brimstone. Another Sunday he preached, "It would not be a wonder if some that are now present should not be in hell in a very short time, and it would be no wonder if some persons that now sit here in some seats of this meeting house, in health, quiet and secure, should be there before tomorrow morning." Around 1720, at the Congregational Church in Northampton, which was outside of Boston the largest, wealthiest, and most prestigious Congregational church in the English colonies, J.E.'s predecessor and uncle, Reverend Stoddard, had instituted the halfway covenant. Prior to that time, in order to be a member of the church, a member was required to walk down the aisle to the front of the church, turn around to face the congregation, then proclaim their faith by telling the story of their personal event of religious awakening and salvation by Jesus Christ. This was called the Wide Aisle Confession of Faith. Under the new halfway covenant, in order to join the church, a member had to merely covenant or agree to lead a godly, good, and sober life. According to Miss Jones, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards, born in East Windsor, Connecticut, October 5, 1703, was the son of Reverend Timothy Edwards, a gentleman of Welsh descent. Jonathan Edwards commenced the study of Latin at the age of 6 and entered Yale College before he was 13 years of age. He received the degree of bachelor at 16, and after 2 years of further study at the same institution, was licensed to preach the gospel. His first settlement with his grandfather at Northampton, February 15, 1727. For several years he was much beloved, and after the death of Mr. Stoddard in 1729, he had sole charge of the flock. In 1729, in Northampton, the Reverend Jonathan Edwards had become sole minister of the First Church. Like Reverend Sargent, J.E., a child prodigy, was the valedictorian of his class at Yale and spent 2 more years studying theology. The years from 1734 to 1750 were marked by prosperity and growing congregations in the New England churches. This was known as the Great Enlightenment. While the parishioners wanted to hear that God was a benevolent spirit, Reverend Edwards put the fear of hell into the Connecticut Valley farming community. Concerned with the morals of the first generation born to the settlers, the Reverend noticed a rise in children conceived out of wedlock. Around 1740 in Northampton, the unwed mother rate among Puritans was over 60%. The dismayed Reverend Edwards wanted to tighten up morality and go back to the wide aisle, rather than the halfway covenant in use at the time. In 1745, when a group of boys looked at a midwife manual, then teased the girls, and Edwards preached against them and condemned them by name, from the pulpit, the parishioners were irate. The bad book incident and J.E.'s intent to return to the wide aisle system and drop the halfway covenant, which had been in use for 30 years before his ordination as minister, plus the public embarrassment of a salary dispute between the trustees and the minister, resulted in Reverend Edwards' dismissal as minister of the Northampton Congregational Church in 1750. Widely regarded as America's most important and original philosophical theologian, Edwards preached 2 main doctrines. First, that God was in absolute control of everything, and second, was the creator of all things beautiful. Miss Jones wrote, Mr. Edwards and his wife were kindred spirits, and they knew it, and enjoyed the advantages of such a similarity. The student was not a recluse, scarcely recognizing his own family, but as iron sharpeneth iron, so these companions sharpened the piety of each other. The study of Mr. Edwards, while in Stockbridge, was at the west end of his house, opening from the west parlor, a little nook. The location is marked by the sundial at 25 Main Street on the Austin Riggs Center lawn. Once or twice during each day, he called his wife in for prayer. Here they always united in devotion after the family had retired at night, and her visits for social interchange of thought were very frequent. His evenings were spent with his family in conversation upon the usual topics of the day, but always upon religion at the last. On Saturday, all labor was closed before the setting of the sun, and the Sabbath was heralded in by a hymn of prayer, praise, and a prayer. Still, President Edwards was a close student during his hours of study, and he never rode to the woods, his daily exercise in summer, without taking his pen with him to note down any happy thought which occurred. And then in the night a pin was often stuck in his curtain to recall some idea in the morning. In the winter he cut wood half an hour or more each day for exercise. Usually he devoted 13 hours of the 24 to study. During the afternoon he felt exhausted and took a cup of strong tea, the same leaves being again used by his prudent wife for the evening meal. His own meals were finished before those of his family, and he would retire to his study to save the few minutes before he was recalled to say grace. To the government of his children he was very attentive, but the temporal concerns of his household were left entirely to his wife. He knew his books and his family, but never visited his people except in sickness, and did not know his own cattle. But he had not a happy talent at conversation unless removed from all restraints, and consciously in the presence of true friends only. He seemed to be created expressly for the work which he accomplished, that of preacher and author. The people of Stockbridge were genuinely united in Mr. Edwards, and much attached to him. When he rose in the pulpit, they expected a treat, not of oratory, but of truth, and though his sermons were long, very long indeed, and he held his notes in one hand, resting his elbow on the desk, and seldom raised the other hand, except to turn over his leaves, yet the congregation looked astonished and disappointed at the close that the discourse had been no longer. In May 1757, Reverend Edwards' son-in-law, president of Princeton Burr, died, and he was urged to become his successor. He had previously declined this office, and now with great reluctance he assented. The objections of both pastor and people were listened to, and after deliberation the council brought in their decision that the cause of Christ called more loudly for the labors of Mr. Edwards at Princeton than at Stockbridge. Mr. Edwards always controlled his feelings in public, but at this announcement he covered his face with his hands and yielded to the relief of tears. The last Sabbath which he spent in Stockbridge, President Edwards read the 20th chapter of Acts, so touchingly appropriate, and preached from the text, "We have here no continuing city," etc. When the day of his departure arrived, he made himself ready, took leave of his family, and stepped into the yard. Turning back, he said, "I commend you to God," and left. These were his last words to them. In February he was inaugurated and entered upon some of the duties of his office. But the smallpox was prevailing in Princeton, and on the 10th of that month he was inoculated. At first all seemed well, but some of the pustules being in the throat, he was unable to swallow the needful medicines, and, as it was expressed, Jesus permitted him to fall asleep on the 22nd of March, 1758. The Reverend Jonathan Edwards was an early media figure and communicator through his extensive writing. While at Stockbridge, he wrote his Inquiry Concerning the Freedom of Will. Using a rotating hexagonal table, now on display in the Stockbridge Library, he penned 6 letters at a time. Congregations around New England were excited to receive the latest letter from the Reverend Edwards. Although he wrote against the slave trade, J.E. has come under criticism for his keeping of slaves. There are many letters written by Mrs. Edwards in which she specifies the skills needed for the family's house slaves. Another Congregationalist missionary, and the third minister of the First Congregational Church, the Reverend Stephen West, was graduated from Yale in 1755. Again we see the Puritan concept of hiring an educated man to be the spiritual shepherd of the flock. Quoting from Miss Jones, January 1759, it was voted to pay Reverend Stephen West an annual salary of £6 sterling, 13 shillings 4 pence, and 4 loads of wood, 40 loads of wood delivered at his door, besides £40 sterling settlement, lawful money, provided he remained as pastor. To this offer he assented, and was set over the people by the ceremony of ordination, June 13, 1759, having been introduced to the town in November of 1758. He was not gay, but always mild, kind, and affectionate, so that while there was an unwillingness to displease him, there was no fear of offending. It is the testimony of an adopted daughter that during the whole of her residence in his family, she never once saw his temper in the slightest degree ruffled, and his colleague, who spent several years in his family, when too he was in the decline of life, says that he never saw him offended except in one instance, and then he quickly repented and went to the kitchen to confess his fault and ask forgiveness of the domestic whom he had sharply rebuked. His even habits had their foundation in an even temper. In preaching he dwelt principally upon the doctrines of grace, the value of which he deeply felt, which he longed to have others enjoy. Dr. West's church, almost a court of law consisting of deacons and elders, was the moral authority. The idea of a town that was ruled by laws set forth in the Bible, Dr. West took literally. He was the judge, the jury, and the sheriff. The penalty was excommunication. In 1782, Sylvia Morgan was excluded from church membership for associating with vain light and airy company, joining them and dancing and frolicking and accompanying with a man on Saturday night, which was to be kept holy as preparation for the church service Sunday morning. One member, David Pixley, who had lived in Stockbridge most of his life, stood accused of being quarrelsome, profane, obstinate, and impertinent toward those who would save his soul. After being publicly admonished, Mr. Pixley expressed his indifference, and Dr. West excommunicated him. 2 years before he himself was dismissed as minister of the church under accusations that Mrs. West had exceeded her prescribed amount of medicinal rum, Dr. West had excommunicated every last remaining Stockbridge Indian. 9 months after his dismissal, the Reverend Stephen West died at age 84. The next Puritan minister was the Reverend David Dudley Field, Doctor of Divinity. He was graduated from Yale in 1802 and was ordained a congregational pastor the next year. He married Submit Dickinson in 1803 and was minister of the Haddam Congregational Church in Connecticut from 1804 to 1818. The Reverend Field served as minister in Stockbridge for 18 years, from 1819 until 1837, when he was called back to the Haddam Church, where he served until 1844. In 1851, after retirement, he and Mrs. Field moved back to Stockbridge. Dr. Field lived in the brick parsonage at 15 Main Street, next to the present site of the Mission House. It was during the ministry of Reverend Field in 1824 that the present red brick church was built on the town green. Reverend Field was a peacemaker, a historian, and used the Halfway Covenant. Published in New York in 1853, an historical sketch of the Church Congregational of Stockbridge, Massachusetts, stated the requirements for membership. Persons desiring of uniting with this church on confession of their faith in Christ shall be examined by the Standing Committee. If approved, they shall be propounded before the congregation on some Sabbath, at least 2 weeks before their reception. If no objection be made, they shall become members of the church by publicly assenting to the confession of faith and covenant prescribed by this church. Attendance at the Lord's Supper was encouraged and celebrated every 2 months throughout the year. Any resident member of this church absent from the Lord's Supper for an entire year without apparent reason shall be visited by a committee, appointed therefore by the permanent officers of the church. If such a neglect of covenant continue for a year thereafter, the church may declare itself discharged from any further watch and care over such person as one who has withdrawn himself from its communion. With diplomacy, Reverend Field wrote of his predecessor, Dr. West's dismissal. A complaint was brought into the church against one of the members, attended with special circumstances, about which the pastors and the members of the church entertained different opinions, and which produced for a time unhappy divisions and much trouble. One effect was that both pastors, Dr. West and his assistant Ephraim G. Swift, were dismissed at the same time, August 27, 1818. Norway, Oslo, 1935. My grandmother Sigrid bought a 16mm movie camera and began the tradition of taking pictures of her family. This is where she lived, in Drøbak, south of Oslo. And this is the party in 1935 of May 17th, Norwegian Independence Day. My grandfather, Magne, is the white shirt and the black tie, and Sigrid with the white tie and the black dress, and then at the end of the line is my father, Leif. So she used this camera to take pictures of church celebrations, family traditions. My father and his brother, Tur, were confirmed in New York the next year. Then my baptism in 1946, my brother's baptism in 1954. So here they are going to church. This is a church in Oslo. So my grandmother is behind the camera now, and that's my grandfather with the white hat. So she would begin this tradition of taking pictures of people coming out of the church. So she hands the camera to Magna, and now she wants the camera, and she'll take a picture of Magna. So after my brother in 1954 in New York, we see the dress that Sigrid made for him, and then we jump to my confirmation, 1957, Portland, Connecticut, and then Fran and our children, Leif, Nicolina, and Wilhelm's baptism and confirmation. Here they are in New York. Look, my father's got a box of Cracker Jacks for his confirmation. Magna's cool cars back there. Once again, my grandmother Sigrid behind the camera. So my father Leif, then, using the same camera, continued the tradition with my brother and I. Reverend Lockhart baptized Leif, Nicolina, and Wilhelm. And then in 2000, 2002, 2003, Leif, Nicolina, and Wilhelm were confirmed. So the Mohican Puritan Church story intersected with my grandmother's movie story, which we continued. The amazing part about this story is that two religious groups circled the world in opposite directions and met here. According to the president of Yale, and according to physical evidence in Pittsfield, both groups used the Old Testament, and they came together in 1734 and agreed to work together and form a church. The religion that's taught here 275 years later has evolved into something that can be easily described by the Mohican religion. So for a short time, we'll watch these home movies of 4 generations going to church, and I'll read the proof of the Jewish origin of the Mohican tribe, and I'll read the summary of the religion as recollected by Chief Alpamut. Reverend Field also believed that the Mohican tribe walked across the Bering Strait from Asia, and quotes the Reverend Timothy Dwight, president of Yale, who wrote in 1821 in his travels in New England and New York about the origin of the Mohican. Quote, "In one instance, therefore, we have found an Indian tradition directly asserting in terms which cannot easily be misconstrued that the Americans, partly at least, came from the eastern shore of Asia." Close quote. Concerning the spiritual origin of the Mohican tribe, Miss Jones wrote, "Many believe the Stockbridge Indians and their kindred tribes to be remnants of the Jewish nation, and that they have at some period in their national existence possessed a part of the Jewish scriptures seems very evident." The interpreter employed by Mr. Sargent informed him that he well remembered the time when the worship of the Great Spirit was not universal among his people, some worshiping the sun and others believing only in chants. But every reader of the Bible must trace in their morning councils a strong resemblance to the Old Testament precepts. They contain just that system of morals which the unrenewed heart is prone to draw from the Bible and to rest in for salvation. The historian, too, informed Dr. West that his people once possessed the Good Book given by the Great Spirit, but having lost the power to read it, they had buried it with a chief. And is it too much to believe that they did once possess the Jewish scriptures and from them derive a knowledge of the true religion, together with those Jewish ceremonies observed among them, that from this they apostatized into idolatry and atheism, but had been led at length to lay aside all visible manifestations and return to the worship of the unseen? Other circumstances also seem to favor such a theory. In 1815, Joseph Merrick, Esquire of Pittsfield, while scraping the ground on what has sometimes been called Indian Hill, found 4 strips of parchment enclosed and sewed watertight in hard thick leather, having the appearance of a portion of the trace of a harness. On the parchment was written in Hebrew characters the identical passages of Scripture which the Jews used as phylacteries. For example, Exodus 13th, 11th to 16th, Deuteronomy 6, 4th to 9th, and 11th, 13th to 21st. In opening the case, Esquire Merrick destroyed one of the strips. The others were sent to the Antiquarian Society. Dr. Likens has recently obtained from Pategui, a Potawatomi residing on the reservation of that tribe near the Kansas River, a similar curiosity which has been exhibited in Washington by Colonel Lee, though not with great publicity. It was only lent to Dr. Likens, the Indians being unwilling to part with it upon any consideration whatever. It consists of four small rolls or strips of parchment, closely packed in the small compartments of a little box or locket, of about an inch cubical content. On these parchments are written in a style of unsurpassed elegance and far more beautiful than print, portions of the Pentateuch, or Torah, to be worn as frontlets and intended as stimulants of the memory and moral sense. The Indian from whom it was obtained had it from his aged grandmother, and it had been in the possession of this particular family about 50 years. Originally there were 2 lockets, but one had been lost in crossing a rapid stream at the north. That was supposed by the Indians to contain an account of the creation. Hitherto these curiosities had been kept from the whites, and only the influence of Dr. Likens with the chief has induced Pategui to expose them to the gaze of a paleface. He had them many years in his possession before he ventured to cut the stitches of the cover and look himself upon the holy charm, and he was then advised by one of the chiefs to keep the whole a profound secret. A half-breed revealed the secret to Dr. Likens. When asked how long they had possessed the amulet, the Indians replied that they had no knowledge of a time when they did not possess it. It has always been kept from exposure for a very long period in the medicine bag, and its age must certainly be reckoned by centuries. To this may be added the testimony of the Delawares, that their ancestor, divided into 10 tribes, besides the spirit of prophecy, possessed the scriptures when they lived upon the other side of the water, that then they prospered, but having sold this gift to the Great Spirit, they sorely offended him, and as a punishment were subjected to oppression from their neighbors. After a time, however, he compassionated their distress, and led them across a great river to this country, drying up the waters before them. Only 9 tribes, they say, consented to immigrate, and from those 9 the Delawares separated at a still later period. Traditions were also found among different tribes of Indians in early times, of the murder of Abel by his brother, of the deluge, of the confusion of Babel, and of the practice among their ancestors of the rite of circumcision. The Mohicans did not pray to personifications of God, such as Jesus or Muhammad, but went straight to the source of the power, the Great Good Spirit. The tribe believed in one benevolent God ruling over nature and the flow of good. In the Mohican world, there was a definite and detailed religion, but no paid professional clergy. The Mohican parents instructed the children in the ways of the spirit and the soul. Here is Chief Albemarle's recounting of the Mohican religion as quoted by Miss Jones in 1854. Our ancestors acknowledged one supreme being who dwells above, before they ever enjoyed gospel revelation, the Great Good Spirit, the author of all things in heaven and on earth, and governs all events, and he is good to all his creatures. They also believed that there was an evil one, wicked spirit that loves altogether to do mischief, that he excites person or persons to tell a lie, angry, fight, hate, steal, to commit murder and to be envious, malicious, and evil-talking, also excite nations to war with one another, to violate their friendship with the Great Good Spirit given them to maintain for their mutual good and their children after them. In order to please the Great Good Spirit they acknowledged to be their dependents, and on the other hand to withstand the evil one. Therefore the following custom was observed, which was handed down to them by their forefathers and considered to be as communicated by the good Great Spirit. The proceeding was the Mohican Word of God, the instruction from the heavens, with the weight of Moses and the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament. The morning counsels to the children seem to be Mohican contemporary examples of the 10 Commandments, and are a masterpiece of a religion tried and proven on the trail, then in the wilderness, for thousands of years, and together with the Puritanism, mark the beginning and is the reason for the niceness of Norman Rockwell's adopted hometown. The head of each family, man or woman, would begin with all tenderness as soon as daylight to waken up their children and teach them as follows. My children, you must remember that it is by the goodness of the great good Spirit we are preserved through the night. My children, you must listen to my words. If you wish to see many good days and evenings, you must love to all men and be kind to all people. If you see any in distress, you must try to help them. Remember that you will also be in distress some time or other. If you see anyone hungry, you must give him something to eat. Though you should have but little cake, give him half of it, for you are also liable to hunger. If you see one naked, you must cover him with your own raiment, for you must consider that some future time you will also stand in need of such help. But if you will not assist or have compassion for the poor, it will displease the good Spirit. You will be called hard-hearted, and nobody will pity on you at the time of your distress, but will mock at you. My little children, if you see aged man or woman on your way doing something, you must pity on them and help them instantly. In doing so, you will make their hearts glad, and they will speak well of you. And further, if you see your neighbors quarreling, you must try to make them be good friends again. And you must always listen to the instruction of old folks, thereby you will be wise. And you must not be hasty to speak when you hear people talking, nor allow yourself too much laughing. And if you find any that would speak evil against you, you must not speak evil words back, but shut your ears and mouth as if you hear nothing, and shun such people. And you must never quarrel to any person, for quarreling belongs to evil spirit and beast. But live in peace with all people. Thereby you will please the good great Spirit, and you will be happy. My little children, you must be very kind to strangers. If you see a stranger or strangers come by the side of your fireplace, you must salute them and take them by the hand and be friendly to them, because you will be a stranger some time or other. You must never speak harsh words to strangers, but use words well as you can. Thereby they will love you and speak well of you, wherever they be. And if you ever come into a strange country, you will meet with such kindness. But if you will not be friendly to such, you will be in danger wherever you go. My children, again listen. You must be honest in all your ways. You must always speak nothing but the truth wherever you are. But if you should love to tell a lie, everybody will take notice of it. Thereby you will bring a bad name to yourself. For instance, whenever people see you walking, they will say to one another with scorn and point at you, "Look at that liar." And even when you should bring tidings of importance with the truth, they will not regard what you say. My children, you must never steal anything from your fellow men, for remember this: you will not be pleased if some of your neighbors should take away your things by way of stealing. And you must also remember that the great good spirits see you. But if you allow yourself to steal, you will hurt your name and disgrace your parents and all relations, and you will be despised by all good people. My children, you must always avoid bad company. And above all, you must never commit murder, because you wish to see a long life. But if you commit murder, the great good Spirit will be angry with you, and your life will be in great danger, also the lives of your dear relations. My children, you must always be very industrious. You must always get up early morning to put on your clothes, moccasins, and tie your belt about you, that you may be ready to do something. By so doing, you will always have something to eat and put on. But if you will be lazy, you will always be poor. Your eye shall be on those who are industrious, and perhaps you will shamefully beg or steal, and none will give you anything to eat without grudging. And further, my children, when you are grown up, you must not take wife or husband without the consent of your parents and all relations. But if you will do contrary to this, perhaps you will be joined to one who will bring great darkness to you, and thereby you will be very unhappy. My children, at all times you must obey your sachem and chiefs, and all good counsels they give, never to speak evil against them, for they have taken much pains in promoting your happiness, and if you do not observe this, you will be looked upon worse than the beasts are. Thus they inculcate instruction to their children day after day until they are grown up, and after they are grown up, yet they would teach them occasionally. And when young people have children, they also teach theirs in like manner. This custom is handed down from generation to another. At the same time, it may be observed that there were some who did not take pains to instruct their children, but would set bad examples before them, as well as there are among such civilized nations. But such men were roving about and could not be contented to stay in one place. The Mohican religion was a result of their early knowledge of the Old Testament, then losing the ability to read, but carrying on the original spirit and soul through oral history and morning councils. The tribe reworked biblical precepts of Judaism into examples that applied to their contemporary lives. According to the Mohican press, despite the hostilities that plagued the settlement, there was an element of Rockwellian tranquility to be found at Stockbridge. Such was the picture painted by Edward's daughter Esther in her journals. She describes with fondness and sincerity a pleasant, almost quaint settlement, replete with sledding, dancing, and close friendships between Mohican and colonial children. So constant was the companionship of the children of Stockbridge that many English children, including Edward's, were not only well versed in Mohegan, but knew words and names in the Algonquin tongue that they knew no English for. In his adopted hometown of Stockbridge, Norman Rockwell, in the middle of the last century, captured a spirit and cooperation, mutual regard, and connection that has its roots in the harmony of the early Indian town.